We spoke for some time about the liberty of the press, I who had never thought about political matters of any kind, and who remembered how much I had suffered in my home life from the license of insult displayed by the English newspapers, attacked this facility for condemning a person on insufficient evidence and for misrepresenting what might be entirely innocent and harmless. I declared that it was necessary to have a certain power of control over the press on account of our national tendency to make fun of serious subjects. Our excessive appreciation of the ridiculous, which distinguished us from other nations, made us unable either to respect or to admire a person or idea which had been wittily pilloried, even unjustly. It was desirable that the French nation should both respect and admire its rulers, for the day they began to be looked at contemptuously, their power was at an end. Madame de Staël easily refuted this, pointing out to me how much more important public welfare was than private interests. She maliciously added that it was clear my ideas were colored by personal experience. She little suspected that neither the emperor nor anyone else ever talked to us about politics. It was the first time in my life I had heard such subjects discussed in my presence. Madame de Staël possessed a great deal of charm when she managed to remain feminine, but her decided manner when arguing a point and her dogmatic attitude, natural enough in the case of such a superior mind, made her appear to me far less attractive than I had expected. When I looked at her, I thought that in order to have inspired as many passions as she had, either men's love must often be a question of vanity, or else she must be endowed with those rare spiritual gifts which alone inspire and preserve affection. She was very intimate with Madame Récamier. Her fine brain and her mental superiority over the other members of her sex did not diminish the other woman's more timid, more elusive appeal. On the contrary, while Madame de Staël dazzled people by the brilliance of her intellect, her companion captivated them by her winning grace. Although the distinguished heir, Madame de Staël, had scored many successes, Madame Récamier possessed a remarkable beauty, a gentleness, a kindliness, and a simple, direct, and subtle common sense which also attracted many admirers. Thus possessing also those qualities which win men's respectful admiration, she was really the Ninon de l'Enclos of our day. I must unconsciously have hurt the pride of authorship in Madame de Staël. As we walked about the garden, we spoke of foreign travels and the beauties of other countries, and being very absent-minded, I asked whether she had ever been to Italy. Everybody at once exclaimed, "And Corinne! Have you forgotten Corinne?" "Of course," I exclaimed, realizing what I had said. But then I read so little of it. "Do you mean to say that you have not read Corinne?" someone inquired anxiously. "Yes, no, that is to say, I must read it again." People looked at me. No one could understand my speaking of such a work in this manner, and especially in front of the author. An explanation was necessary. It did not seem an appropriate moment to make it. This was what had occurred. The novel entitled Corinne appeared just after I had lost my son. The book was given me to distract me from my melancholy, but overwhelmed as I was with grief, I recalled only a few phrases, some descriptions, and felt a fear of rereading a volume the memory of which was connected with my misfortune. Madame de Staël's visit made the government so uneasy that the secretary of the Russian embassy, Monsieur de Botiaguina, informed me the fact, and this was why I made no attempt to see her again. I went to take the waters at Plombières, accompanied by a single lady in waiting. The place was a melancholy one. The only people I knew were Monsieur and Madame de Saint-Hilaire and General de la Borda and his wife. I had been expecting my brother for 2 weeks when I received word asking me to meet him at Baden. The Grand Duchess of Baden also extended me an invitation. The waters there being about the same as at Plombières, I did not hesitate to accept. There were a great many foreigners at Baden just then. Among them were the Empress of Russia, the King and Queen of Bavaria, the dethroned Queen of Sweden, the Duchess of Hesse-Darmstadt, and the Margravine of Baden, the mother of all these princes. As soon as I arrived, the King of Bavaria, as usual, very kind to me, hastened to call. We exchanged visits with the other princesses, and I had no reason not to be pleased with the way in which they received me. It was evident that they were curious about me. The Emperor of Russia, in his letters to his family, had often spoke of me, and their friendly attitude showed. I could not help being pleased with their attentions, which were both marked and affectionate. The Empress of Russia invited me to dinner with all the queens and princesses who happened to be there. She possessed a great dignity of bearing, together with a savoir-parler that was truly royal. Her features were distinguished, and it was evident that she must have been very beautiful. Her voice had an inexpressible charm, and her melancholy air made her particularly lovely. The Queen of Bavaria, her sister, resembled her in many respects. I've always found her so kind and sympathetic toward me that I would not be speaking impartially if I expressed all my admiration for her. The German princesses possess a certain affability, but in general they are not natural enough. After you have met them, you always find them exactly the same. Most of them are not aware that lofty rank demands simplicity, that kindliness is a ruler's greatest charm, just as an act of charity is his first duty. Generally, they are too much overawed by the rules of etiquette, while, of course, a certain amount of formality and reserve is necessary at court, where lack of them would set a bad example. Still, in domestic circles, all constraint should be abolished and greater familiarity be made the rule. I received a visit from Madame de Krüdener, whom I had not seen since my trip to Baden in 1809. She now spent all her time taking care of the poor and the unfortunate. I found her still more high-strung than she had been before, exceedingly tender and sensitive in her religious beliefs, placing love before all else in the world. Her voice had taken on a tone of prophecy and exhortation, her features an inspired expression. She communicated her feelings the more easily to others because she vibrated so intensely with them. She persuaded people because she herself was so sincerely convinced. Indeed, it required a decidedly strong will to resist the lure of the marvelous visionary universe she described, a universe which her whole-hearted benevolence made still more attractive. It was hard not to fall a victim to the powers of her imagination. She began by deploring in most moving terms the losses we had suffered, that of a devoted friend, a dearly loved mother, not to mention my lofty position. And she urged me to bear all this without complaint as a form of trial, the reward of which I should receive in the life to come. Her words fell on willing ears. I wept as I listened to her, and she mingled her tears with mine. All at once she said to me in a mysterious tone, "If you wish to do so, you could know what had become of those you loved." My sobs immediately ceased. I felt myself in the presence of a madwoman, and my surprise was so great I could not answer. She noticed this and made no attempt to convince me. Changing the subject, she inquired what my plans were, and when I replied that I intended to stay in France, she exclaimed, "Do not stay in France. You do not know the misfortunes that will overtake you. Go to Russia. Only the people who are there will be saved." But I answered, it was the Emperor of Russia himself who decided that I and my children should remain in France. Perhaps I should have done better to go and live with my brother. He has not yet received the territory that was promised him, but will ask for it at the Congress of Vienna. "Ah," she replied, "that Congress will never end. Mark my words. Emperor Napoleon will leave Elba. He will become greater than ever, but those who have taken his side will be persecuted, pursued, and scattered. They will not know where to lay their heads." "What can I do?" I said. "I'm his daughter, and if he returns, I must cast my lot with him." She left me repeating, "Remember 1815. After all the very real misfortunes that had overtaken me, the hallucinations of a mystic could not make much of an impression on me. I also met at the house of Grand Duchess of Baden, Princess Ypsilanti, son of the last Hospodar of Wallachia. He described vividly the sad lot of Greece enslaved under a foreign yoke, and spoke of his joy if he should ever be able to succeed in freeing it from its oppressors. I shared his enthusiasm. I also deplored the fact that instead of exhausting their strength by fighting amongst themselves, the civilized nations did not unite to deliver such an unhappy race. The generosity of the prince's feelings pleased me. In accordance with my habit of distributing good luck charms to those who were about to go into battle, I gave him a talisman to protect him from the dangers upon which he seemed about to embark. I was far from imagining that his dreams were so soon to become realities, and that fate had marked him for a gloomy death in a cell at Munkacs. I left at the end of August to return to St. Lou. I again bade farewell to my brother, who was about to go to Vienna to claim vainly that position which the treaties had stipulated he was to receive, while I, instead of enjoying the peace which I so desired, was about to find myself again in the midst of intrigues, plots, and dangers of every description. I traveled both day and night. At 6 o'clock in the evening, just as my horses were being changed at Saverne, I caught sight of 4 French officers in a little carriage stopping outside the posting house. They exclaimed, "There is Queen Hortense." French officers could never fail to recognize Queen Hortense. I sought to remain as inconspicuous as possible, for I had no reason to seek too flattering tokens of recognition, and I gave orders to leave immediately. The evening was so lovely that I had my carriage stop farther on at the foot of a hill in order to walk a little way. To my astonishment, I saw these young men follow me. They bowed, greeted me by name, and expressed their pleasure at the opportunity of catching a glimpse of the daughter of their emperor. They offered to escort me as far as the top of the hill. I accepted, unwilling to repulse their politeness. One of them expressed his despair at seeing France in such a humiliating position. Another declared that he would rather be in chains again, as he had been for a long time while a prisoner in England, than witness the disintegration of our army. They spoke of the enforced abdication of the emperor, of his anniversary, which they had just celebrated in spite of the rule forbidding such commemorations, and they swore never to rally to a dynasty which had been imposed by foreigners. I sought to quiet them, insisting on the benefits of peace, the necessity of resigning oneself to circumstance, and of resting after having accomplished so many heroic feats. "No," they all replied, "we cannot live and feel ourselves humiliated. Remember us if you ever have need of us. We shall always be utterly devoted to you. A word from you will be enough to make us undertake any enterprise. Here are our names, and those of the regiment we belong to." At that moment we arrived at the top of the hill, on which stood a triumphal arch, just erected to the Duc de Berry, who, so they told me, was expected shortly, but they added, "It is you who will be the first to pass beneath it." Seeing this, and catching sight of the guards who were supposed to protect the arch, they carried me towards it, shouting as they did so, "Long live Queen Hortense." What luck, they added. At least this one triumphal arch will have served some useful purpose. I was anxious to reach the posting house, and my expression must have been that of a criminal undergoing his punishment, for such a demonstration, particularly under existing conditions, was not at all to my liking. When at Pfalzburg, the officers saw I was keeping on traveling by night. They wished to accompany me on horseback, conscious of the fact that they did not care how far they compromised themselves. I had all the trouble in the world to make them understand that although such devotion touched me, it could nevertheless do me a great deal of harm. They finally left me, and I was much relieved. I never saw them again and have never heard them mentioned, but as my readers will readily understand, when later I heard that these regiments under Marshal Ney were advancing to meet the Emperor, I had no doubt which side they would take. I arrived at St. Lou without further incidents, but only stayed there a few days. My doctors had ordered me to take some sea baths after the waters. I left for Havre, again accompanied only by one lady in waiting. I preserved the strictest incognito, and was rather annoyed at first not to be able to find a room except in a second-rate inn filled with English people. Fate, however, was kind to me. I had told my valet de chambre to go and knock on all the doors on the quay to see if there was not a house for rent. The first place he went, he encountered an old couple who were about to leave for their country place, and who, without knowing who I was, agreed to rent their house on my servant's word that we were respectable people. I spent 2 very quiet weeks there, taking my baths, going for walks, reading, all entirely alone. One day I was invited by my landlords to take tea with them in the country. The flower beds and the drawing room were filled with hortensias. They praised the flower and spoke of the queen after whom it had been named. I had not yet been recognized, but soon rumors of my presence caused my old couple to call. They were deeply upset, fearing they had been frightfully impolite, and begged my pardon. I at once put them at their ease, and they informed me that this house was the one where I had lived at the age of 4 with my mother when she was about to sail for Martinique. Chance had brought me back to it 26 years later. How many things had taken place in the meantime? How many events, happy and unhappy, had occurred to both my country and myself? I was even introduced to the captain who had commanded our ship. This coincidence delighted my hosts, who had become my friends, and also struck me as curious. I returned to Saint Leu. This time I had decided not to leave it again and to devote myself entirely to my children's education. I felt a sort of satisfaction at the thought that in the midst of their misfortune, they would at least acquire a firmly grounded education far from the flatteries and distractions of the court, and in a situation which required a man to depend on his own ability and to develop what talents he possessed. The weather was marvelous. I had gained some of my strength after so many vicissitudes. Felt that the time of tranquility to which I felt I was entitled had at last come. It did not last long. One morning, a young man, Monsieur Briata, presented himself. He was stiff in his manner, abrupt in his speech, convinced of his own importance, and thoroughly suited to the negotiation which he had been instructed to carry on. Formerly, my husband's private secretary in Holland, Monsieur Briata, had through his protection obtained a post as referendary at the Cour des Comptes in Paris and kept up a correspondence with his former master. From the latter, he had received orders to come and claim my elder son for me, as the boy's father insisted absolutely on their being together. He even pointed out how kind he was to leave me the younger child. The tone of the letter, which demanded that the child be turned over to Monsieur Briata, was a threatening one. This blow stunned me. Although I had feared it for a long time, it fell on me as if unforeseen. My whole life revolved around my children. It was for them that I sought to regain my health. For them I struggled to keep alive. The thought of my loved ones was the only thing that sustained me amid all my tribulations. The idea of being separated from them filled me with terror. I wished to be able to reason coolly, but my brain throbbed frantically with emotion. I was clearly aware of all the dangers that threatened my son if he left my side. His father's poor health would result in his neglecting the child's education, and he would not know how to form his character. Might not even the boy's own health suffer and his natural good disposition become altered? My mind and heart were so completely at one in this dilemma that I took the grave step of refusing my husband's demands. Daily, I summoned up my willpower. Daily, I fixed my mind on the idea of resisting his wishes because I felt it was my duty to do so. It was simple enough for me to point out that my son ought to remain in France and that his personal interest lay in his staying on in his native land. I emphasized this point. I also wrote my husband that I was willing to take his children to see him. I implored him not to ruin their future, but to seek to make it as happy as possible. It was with anxiety that I awaited his answer, which it seemed to me would be a question of life and death to me. Having finished my period of deep mourning, I thought of expressing my thanks to the king for having granted me permission to remain in France and for having created the duchy, which my children could eventually inherit. To be sure, the Emperor of Russia had told me I should not do this, in view of the hostile attitude which Louis XVIII's ministers and the king himself had shown in regard to the issuance of the letters patent. At the same time, I felt that I owed him a visit. He had become the ruler of that France where I intended to spend the rest of my life as a private citizen, where I had no one to protect me, and where I felt myself surrounded with malevolent intrigues and perils of all sorts. Already I felt that people were looking at me with suspicion, and I thought the best way to prevent their having any pretext for adopting this attitude was to pay the king a visit of courtesy. To do this was less disagreeable to me than my friends imagined, for I felt I was doing right. If I received a cold reception, the fault would not be mine. Moreover, I had decided to withdraw if anyone was in the least rude to me. I asked for a private audience, My request was granted without the least difficulty. The following morning, at 11 o'clock, I presented myself accompanied by a lady-in-waiting. I had asked Monsieur Lavalette to act as my escort. I was ushered into the throne room where I had so often waited in the past. Nothing had been changed. The N's and the eagles were everywhere. I was less troubled by so many memories than one might have thought, for then, as always, I was convinced that happiness was not the lot of those who dwell in such palaces.